All right, good morning, people. Today we are going to make our way through the end of um, the things they carried. So this will be the last official sort of Zoom meeting we have about the things they carried. Though, hit me up with a question. Join the Google Hangout, ask a question, whatever it is you want to do. Right? We're good. We're good. So we got that going on. So let's get right to it. Page 111, stockings. And what's going to happen is I'm going to move a little bit faster today, I think, through the stuff, to the stories, and just kind of hit on some things. I think the second half of the novel, especially, highlights what I would call, it's not different than the first half, but it very much is in keeping with O'Brien's postmodernist tendencies. So the second half is, as we'll see as we kind of like go through, is both fragmented, nonlinear, but yet there are linkages, right? There are connections that he makes, and so it has this kind of postmodern aura about it, the nonlinearity of it, the fragmentation of it. And yet it is written as a kind of, I think I'll argue, like a kind of search for truth, with the recognition that it's not there, but that we can create it. And that's kind of going to be, well, not to spoil it, but I think that's kind of the point of the last story itself. So we're picking up after the Sweetheart of the Song Trombone. We're picking up with Stockings on page 111. A little excerpt, little anecdote, so to speak, about Henry Dobbins. And it's what is really telling about this, and this is where I think O'Brien is really smart, is his ability to sort of tell us about character and do sort of narrative things, while yet at the same time suggesting certain kind of more overarching political things. I don't see O'Brien as an overtly political writer, but he is a politically aware writer, I guess is how I'd frame it, especially when it comes to Vietnam. And so you have this very overt telling, right? Henry Dobbins is like America. The narrator tells us in that sense. He's loyal, he may be slow, but he's consistent, he gets there. And the other thing, though, I think that is interesting about this story is at the end of it, right? So when Dobbins' girlfriend dumps him, and but he keeps wearing the stockings, right? He keeps his belief going, right? And he says, the company believed in the stockings, but then the girlfriend dumps him, and you think that would be it. But he says, no sweat, the magic doesn't go away. And I think that there is, O'Brien is touching on or pointing us in the direction of just that power of belief, right? If we believe a thing, if we believe in something, if we believe in the greatness of America, if we believe that this is the case or that's the case, that we can sort of almost will that into existence. Belief, in a certain sense, by its very nature, one could sort of think about it, suggests a kind of lack of absolute truth. And if it was there, you could find it, you could know it, and you would have the thing. But the role of belief and faith suggests that role of doubt, that role of uncertainty, which that's, again, the argument could be made, be happy to make it, take me a little while, that is part of postmodernism as well, right? That kind of act of self-creation. It's telling that a story about belief and faith and questions about certainty, even related to girlfriends and pantyhose, is followed by a little short piece called Church, about the soldiers taking over a church, a pagoda, and the two monks that are left there, and how they interact with the monks and what it's like to be, to be there, how they feel about that. And I think that then there's this follow-up question. Henry Dobbins, again, kind of the main character in this little short story, And tellingly, Dobbins, thinks about the idea of becoming a religious person. In fact, taking on the job of a preacher, right? And how what he wants in the job is not the intellectual part, but he wants the doing, going out and visiting people, et cetera, et cetera. And I the way that jobs can kind of craft our identity, the way that jobs become, sort of like who we are. Think about the struggles that maybe you've been having. I know I've had some, just questions about, not that I think I'm like not a person anymore, because I'm not in a classroom teaching, but it has been interesting to think about the role of the actual physical space, the school building, the school campus, the classroom itself, and how those things sort of defined what I did and how I saw myself. And now it's, whoa, what's happening here? And I think that's fairly common, right? I mean, you can sort of maybe see that on a national scale. People across America are asking those questions. And maybe it's behind some of, maybe that's behind some of the impetuses to try to reopen issues about job. I mean, there's just certain issues about money. But there's also, I think, latent in that some sort of question about, who are we? And if we can't work and we can't go to football games, then who are we? It's not that we're nobody, right? But that's a harder question to answer. Who are we when we don't have certain things established? And I think that OBrien, in a very small way in these two chapters, is touching on that. We get to the man I killed, sort of the most seemingly, most like a memoir kind of chapter, the one that would seemingly be the most true, if we're thinking about Tim OBrien, the overlap between author and character. In person, Tim OBrien does talk about how this story was born out of the genesis of the story was in a firefight, in an exchange of gunfire that he went through. And the aftermath of it was that there was a dead Vietnamese soldier. And Tim OBrien, the author, said that he's always wondered whether or not it was some of his bullets that killed the man. But it did not happen like this. But I think it's, again, if we think about the things they carried as a war novel, it's a story made up of war stories, then here is kind of, in a way, the antithesis of your typical war story. I mean, look at any Hollywood war movie, right? The killing seems to come so easily and so naturally to the characters. I mean, it's just what you do. Maybe that's an issue about identity again. But for Tim OBrien, the character, right, that action he took on that pathway was a really difficult and complicated one. Interestingly enough, two small side notes I think about this little story is that, coming back to issues of identity and the job that you have, is that he makes the point on page 122, 123 a couple of times that his action, the hurling of the grenade, happened without thought. It just happened, right? He was like barely aware that was taking place because that was the job he'd been trained for, right? The repetition. This is what you do. This is what you do. This is what you do. And then he does it without even thinking, is this the best move at this time? Just the power of muscle memory, so to speak, which I think is worth thinking about. Certainly it's not non-existent in the world that you and I inhabit. The other thing I think that is really telling about this little story is that it's the power of language within it. This is, if we just keep tabs, right, is one of the more profane stories. That is to say, there's more profanity in this story than many, many other stories, especially given that you're thinking about, a novel made up of supposedly told in first person by somebody that went through a war. So, the power of, I put some files up on the website related to the archive, the Tim OBrien archive at the Harry Ransom Center at UT Austin, right? And one of the things I pointed out was that in the drafts, he kept taking out profanity. He kept removing it. And in part, if you're not somebody that swears a lot, then when you do swear, right, it's like, whoa, it's a big deal. You know this from the classroom, right? If your teacher swears, right, it's kind of a big deal because the teacher's not supposed to swear. You're not supposed to swear in the classroom, right? So it's the absence of a thing makes it, in a sense, more present and more volatile when it does happen. And so when O'Brien does slip into some profanity here, it registers because we haven't seen him for a while. And then finally, the last thing that is fascinating about this little story is the way that he invents a biography for this man that he killed, right? Totally unknown, no way to find out. But it's telling that, he humanizes this man. And in part, we could say that perhaps, or we could ask, is that also a political move, right? If we're going to send young men and young women off to war and ask them to kill people on our behalf, right? Do they get a chance to think about who they're killing? What was this person's occupation? What was his or her hopes and dreams, right, before this happened? So I think O'Brien's inventiveness, right, the art of storytelling, to make us again pause and think about what is it that we're about to do. So, so that's the man I killed, and it segues to the future version, not the future, but the present tense version of that story with Ambush, right? When he has to try to explain to his daughter what he'd done, and we get a lot of repetition of the incidents and the feelings of that story. Right, so, but that to me is kind of like, it's such an antithesis. I wouldn't say it's ironic, but it certainly is not what you expect about killing the enemy from a war novel. And in that, I think, Tim O'Brien delivers in a postmodern fashion. We get to Speaking of Courage, the Norman Bowker story, which again, what I like about O'Brien is rather than try to politicize the events of the Vietnam War, instead of doing that, he gives you little narratives from inside, right? So instead of thinking about the protesters and kind of en masse, right, what was going on in America at the time, protesting against the Vietnam War, we get On the Rainy River, the story about Tim O'Brien, the character, toying with the idea about fleeing to Canada. And instead of the dynamic heroism of a war, of a battle, we get The Man I Killed, a kind of elegiac, poignant story about one person killing one other person, and what that feels like. And now, instead of sort of like, again, looking at just like the scope of the homecoming stories, vets returning from Vietnam, what was that like? We get a little snippet. We get the Norman Bowker story. Norman Bowker coming back from Nam, doesn't bring home the medals that he thinks his father wants him to bring home, doesn't have a real, kind of what you would say, ability to talk to his father about what happened. And then, the tragedy of not being able to sort of adapt to what's going on, and what he does, at the end, the suicide at the end. And so in order to tell us what it felt like to go to Nam and come back, we instead get a story. And a story that one might suggest, was probably more closer to the truth for a lot of soldiers than maybe what was covered in the news media. So there it is on page 143, Norman Bowker wrestles with, one of the things that Norman wrestles with inside his head is that, he doesn't have what he thinks of as the stereotypical good war story to tell. And it's, I think one of the hallmarks of postmodernism is that rise of popular culture and its influence in our lives, the way we understand, the world around us and how we engage with it. And Norman Bowker has spent enough time in popular culture that he understands there's such a thing as a good war story. And what he feels let down by, perhaps, is that he wasn't part of a war that he feels like gave him good war stories. There was no valor. There was nobody that wanted to know about how horrific it was, he feels. If those are the stories you have, it's not worth it. right? You know, and then we get the weird interaction that he has at the drive-in, the burger drive-in, where he doesn't feel like he knows the lingo, or he tries to, you know, make some light of the lingo, the hip popular culture sort of thing, and it just doesn't work well, right? So, you know, Norman doesn't fit in. He can't make the readjustment back to normal life. He can't figure out what to do. And so instead he writes a real long letter to Tim O'Brien, the character, and after doing so, he hangs himself. So it's, you know, this narrative stands in perhaps for larger things. What I find really fascinating from a kind of literary and maybe postmodernist sort of point of view is on page 149 then, is after you've had the Norman Docker narrative, which is told in a pretty linear fashion, is you get the kind of story behind the story. What was it, right? What was it the author, in a sense, Tim O'Brien, the character, who's an author, right? He says, here's what I was thinking about. Here's the genesis of that. Here's where that came from. You know, so he takes a narrative and he unpacks it, he dissects it and says, here's how we got to that. And so it's, you know, he talks about the letter, he talks about what Norman was going through. You even get like quotes in the letters. You get a reference to Tim O'Brien, the character, referencing a novel by Tim O'Brien, the author, you know, sort of problematizing that boundary line between truth and reality, fact and fiction, you know, and again, revealing how characters are made, that kind of thing. And we get that great quote, which, you know, which Miss Judd drew our attention to in the last Google Hangout. So you should show up. You know, on page 152, by telling stories, you objectify your own experience. The very act of putting your life, what you felt about your life, your experience as you perceived it of your life, down in black and white, in ink, on a page, right, in a way does provide a kind of lens of objectivity. It does give us a little sort of scope, or a place where we can at least feel like we're claiming objectivity. And we can walk away with that feeling. But it's, you know, as he goes on to point out, sometimes, you know, you pin down certain truths, but you make up others. You start sometimes with an incident that truly happened, and you carry it forward by inventing incidents that did not in fact occur, but that nonetheless help to clarify and explain. My contention as a reader, as a teacher reader perhaps, is that the vast majority, if not 100% of the whole novel is fictional, but it's O'Brien attempting to find stories that help us feel something. I think Tim O'Brien, the author, is highly invested in that, this idea that we need to feel something. You know, he's invested in the power of literature, which again is a point that he's going to get to. So from there, we get to, and it's mentioned because it's mentioned, and this is where there's one of those things where there's like, it's not linear from chapter to chapter, so to speak, but the Kiowa Shitfield story does get mentioned in notes. And now we start to get, you know, and we don't know that story, and now we get that. We get in the field, which is, again, and here's a kind of structural repetition, the way that we got certain, you know, the way that we got stockings and then church, and we got the man I killed, and we got ambush. We get these sort of, O'Brien is constructing something here, even if it's not linear, it's connected, and now we got a mention of the Kiowa incident, and now we're going to get the story of it as a more kind of narrative. I'm sure that you thought this when you read it or wondered about it. I think the same thing, that the boy in the field is a stand-in for Tim O'Brien, the character. Why he doesn't mention it, why he doesn't name names, again, perhaps issues about trying to heighten the emotional tension of the narrative. But Kiowa gets sucked under, gets shot, gets sucked under into the shit field, right? And they can't find him. The boy is kind of traumatized. And we can't really sort of we're left feeling that kind of sense of loss that the boy feels, and it's of course telling that the loss is both not just losing your friend, but literally losing the body, losing everything. And of course, you also might have noticed when you read this, right, the repetition, not the repetition, but the way that there's a nice comparison between the lake and the Norman Bowker incidents and now the shit field, right? Both characters dealing with what's in this and what's, this kind of using this geographic landmark as a touchstone. Right, and so then after we have that, we go on the field trip, where Tim O'Brien, the author, now older, takes his daughter with him to sort of see, kind of like, here's what Dad's been doing, here's what Dad's been wrestling out. Takes her to Vietnam, takes Kathleen to Vietnam, and along the way, or while they're there, they go find this shit field again so that he can leave Kiowa's moccasins there. Right, I kind of trying to bring some sense of closure to that. And I think that move, that little segue there is a kind of nice emblem or device for a lot of the second half of the book, but probably the whole book as well. And that is, I think Tim O'Brien, the author, is asking questions about memories. What do you do with memories? How do memories function? And the idea that we construct memories as narratives, right? I mean, I don't know that the brain on its own, in fact, I would suggest to you, the brain doesn't know to do that automatically. We've built narrative into how we see and engage with the world. And so the brain then treats our memories that way. Or, there's a half volitional structuring of memories in the form of stories, which perhaps suggests why stories are so powerful, right, for cultures, why we hang on to, why we want things to function like stories. And so we get that here. And we get that, the second half of this novel is a lot of that. Incidents, memories, incidents, and memories. So as a structuring device, I mean, I think there's stuff to be done. There's work, ways to think about this. And so we get that. How do we deal with the past? And of course, that is one of the hallmark issues of the Vietnam War, is how have we as a country, let alone individuals, dealt with the past. From there, we go to the story I like the least, Ghost Soldiers. I like it the least because it's a story about desire and vulnerability. And, and in this case, Tim O'Brien, the author, acts on his desire to bring terror, to bring fear to somebody that he perceives as having wronged him in some way, shape, or form. And in the actual act of making that happen, he realizes it was a mistake, but he can't stop it. He can't get Azar to back off. And I think that level of vulnerability, that level of desiring something, and the recognition that oftentimes when you get your desire, it's that you realize it's not what you really wanted at all. And it brings about for me at least, certain questions about the kind of person I actually am. Let's face it, we're human being, right? I've desired things that I'm sure weren't good or helpful or beneficial. And sometimes I kind of got those things and it wasn't great. And it was maybe a lot less than great. To me, that's the power of a good narrative, right? Is it brings up not just good feelings, but it also has the power to bring up sort of bad feelings. And so because those stories, I think I've done nothing like that, never been worked, but in a certain sort of way, the emotional toll of what Tim O'Brien, the character, is going through cuts a little close to home for me. And so it's not a stylistic or poorly written aesthetic reason. If anything, probably it's a great story because it brings that out in me. And I think that is, not to rush, but the last couple of stories, Nightlife and then Lives of the Dead, I think that's what O'Brien is after in this whole narrative, right? Is wrestling out and trying to do something to create a work of art that engages us in how we think about ourselves and how we think about the ways in which language and stories can do things for us. And as the character says on pretty much the last page of the novel, right? After he tells the story, that little poignant story about Linda and his first date back in, you know, 4th grade, and her brain tumor, right? And he realizes that some 30 years later, I realize it is as Tim trying to save Timmy's life with a story. The idea of stories as a way to salvation, a kind of balm or salve, a kind of way to save our souls, so to speak. And that we do so, one of the ways that we try to do so is through story. And we try to do it through the narratives we tell ourselves. And so you have this collection, I think, working exactly on that. I mean, I think that's what OBrien is about in this story. And I think it's useful for 18-year-olds, especially. I think you're the best audience in many ways to start thinking about these things. I think you were too young 2 years ago. Right, for 18-year-olds and going forward into adulthood, thinking about the narratives that we use to guide our lives, to find comfort in our lives. Certainly it's not wrong to do that. I think in a certain way, some suggest maybe that's all we have, our narratives, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, who we are, how we create ourselves out of these stories. And literature is a place where we get a chance to explore that. Which I find just sort of endlessly fascinating, right? Probably why I became an English teacher, is that kind of endless fascination with stories to tell us things about ourselves. We look at somebody else, in a sense, this character's existence, what they've gone through, and it does, you know, in the end, it does something to us. So that's what I got. That's what I think about the things they carried. I really, you know, I'm a big fan of the novel, obviously, I hope you enjoyed it. I'm glad you stuck with it all the way through. I'm really glad if you stuck with these videos all the way through. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. You got questions come up about this, email me, hang out with me at a Google chat, just, you know, drop on by, ask. I love talking about this stuff. So there's that. This, you want to know about this? I fell off my unicycle. So, all right. That's what Whiteside's been up to. Hope you all are doing well. Stay safe, social distance, be mindful, and I look forward to seeing you all soon in some way, shape, or form.